Pokemon Journeys has been an interesting ride to say the least. In many ways, it is simultaneously a notable departure from what's come before, yet still firmly aligned with certain aspects of the classic Pokemon formula. And its execution of these disparate elements is perhaps the most varied in quality that I've seen from a Pokemon TV series so far. In that sense, Journeys is perhaps the most fitting of Pokemon's TV entries for a deep dive analysis. It does a lot of things exceptionally well, a lot of things really poorly, and a lot of stuff that's just kind of okay. A whole spectrum of quality to be explored and analyzed. But even more so than that, it just does a whole lot of stuff, period, which we'll get into shortly. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Or rather, let's take this moment to slowly wade in and get acclimated to the waters. In order to properly analyze and critique a piece of art, one should at least take the time to understand what said art is attempting to do, and how it is attempting to engage with the audience. In simpler terms, what is the point of the Pokemon anime? I've already answered this question in depth in at least 2 previous videos, and I highly recommend this one if you want more explanation, but the condensed answer is that Pokemon is a highly episodic comedy adventure anime about people interacting with Pokemon. And contained within that framework, we have the story of a young boy and his Pikachu training and battling their way across the world of Pokemon as the focal point through which the story is conveyed. Now, I am not saying that Pokemon doesn't have an overarching plot or that said plot is unimportant. I want to be crystal clear on those points because it's going to come up again later in this video. There are plenty of episodes that one could consider plot-driven. Rather, my intent behind this statement is that, on the broadest level possible, Pokemon is not about the plot progression of a given season, but rather the individual adventures that make up the entirety of the story. While each season does certainly have some core unifiers, it's the individual episodes that are the primary draw. It's why I keep a massive spreadsheet of every episode I've seen and my personal ratings for each one. Well, actually, I do that because I'm an insane person, but you get my point. It's also important to note that each season of Pokemon has some slight, but noticeable differences in how they approach this concept. Some lean more into the adventure side of things, while others are a bit more relaxed. As for Journeys specifically, I noticed fairly early on that it really wanted to lean into the comedy part of comedy adventure. And to be honest, it succeeded. This might be the funniest season of Pokemon to date. There were a ton of episodes that actually got me to laugh out loud, with excellent comedic timing and the extremely expressive faces of the Pokemon deftly crafting one solid punchline after another. Granted, not all of the jokes hit, and it definitely felt like it lost some comedic steam in the end, but it put such a strong humorous foot forward that I was ready to roll with this particular version of the Pokemon anime, and it very quickly managed to set my expectations appropriately, as this shift on the genre spectrum would be a forecast of other, much larger structural changes. Speaking of which, Journeys might have the most unique story structure out of all of Pokemon's TV entries. Rather than drop Ash and friends into a new region and explore it top to bottom, our heroes instead take up positions as research fellows to Professor Sakuragi in Vermilion City. By the way, I'm mostly going to be using Japanese names for characters that I've only seen the subbed version of, though I will be using the English localization for all of the Pokemon. I haven't watched the dub in like 15 years, so I'm just going with what's comfortable. Using his lab as a base from which they explore not just the newest region, but also every other region that Ash has visited so far, allowing for practically limitless possibilities for the kinds of adventures Ash can take on. While I wouldn't say that confining each of the previous seasons to a single region made them feel constrained in any way, Journeys giving the story complete access to regional variety was easily the most interesting tool in its toolkit. Any region, any character, any Pokemon is up for grabs, and since variety of premise has always been a core strength of the anime's writing, this element seemed like a perfect fit. It also allows for easy access to fan-favorite characters at a moment's notice. Want to have Paul prep Ash for the World Championships? Sure thing. Bring Dawn back multiple times for all the Sinnoh-centric plotlines? Why not? Have Gary become Go's rival for Project Mew to mirror his earlier relationship with Ash? Abso-frickin-lutely. Nostalgia has been a powerful tool in the Pokemon anime's arsenal for a while now, and while I was definitely wary that it would rely too much on fan service, most of the moments where those elements came up turned out to be incredibly well written and reverent of past source material, while never directly trampling over new ideas for the sake of nostalgia. There is an indirect drawback to this, but we'll get there in a moment. You also don't even need nostalgia to enjoy these premises. I've only seen a handful of episodes from Best Wishes, but I can say without a doubt that episode 65, which had Ash reunite with Iris, was one of the best episodes of this season. Ash and Iris immediately feel like old friends as soon as they see each other, and their dynamic is one of the strongest in the entire season, even more so than with some of the actual main characters. On the flip side, nostalgia can also be weaponized to play with expectations. In episode 105, Koharu and Eevee travel to Lily Cove City to meet a trainer who has a Sylveon, and it's eventually revealed that this trainer is none other than Serena, Ash's companion from X and Y, who ends up coaxing Koharu into a Pokemon contest. Consequently, because Ash and Go are already there for research purposes, they decide to go see Koharu's performance. Given how X and Y ends, many fans,
yes, hello, hi, I am fans,
have been desperately waiting for these two to reunite. However, the episode uses Wallace to delay Ash and Go getting to Koharu's performance, and so it's not until the very end of the episode that we get that long-awaited reunion. Firstly, how dare you toy with my emotions? Secondly, this actually works way better than having them be together for the entire episode. Keeping Ash away allows Koharu's experience with Pokemon contests to take center stage, while also maximizing the emotional impact of the reunion by condensing it at the very end. It's just enough of a tension release to be satisfying, but also cuts it short, leaving that final lingering question unaddressed because there's no way they were actually going to give an answer to that. With the knowledge that this is Ash's final season, giving him access to everything that's come before seems like a no-brainer, and I'm happy this element was so well executed. There is, however, a massive downside to this way of structuring the story. Typically, each season of Pokemon goes to great lengths to explore the new region for the specific games it's based on. Going into Journeys, one might think this would hold true with the Galar region introduced in Sword and Shield, but that's very much not the case. Because it has to share the spotlight with every other region up to that point, Galar is easily the most underdeveloped in terms of its unique appeal as a region. Outside of the Gigantamax battles and the very, very brief bits of the game's plot, Galar almost seems like an afterthought in terms of how this series was written, to the point where I was kinda shocked every time I hit an episode that actually took place there. Journeys seems much more interested in revisiting past regions, Kanto and Sinnoh in particular, than exploring a brand new one with near limitless potential. Again, this is a direct result of the structure Journeys chose to use, and I do like a lot of the past region episodes, but it's undeniable that they came at the expense of Galar. When I think back on Journeys and what made Galar so interesting as a region on an aesthetic or world-building level, the only thing I can recall is the Gigantamax battles. It doesn't show off cultural richness like Kalos, or peaceful interspecies cooperation like Alola, or an ancient atmosphere like Johto. It's just kinda there for stories to take place in. Woefully underdeveloped because it has to share the bulk of this season's screen time with other regions. This brings us to what I believe lies at the heart of what makes Journeys the way it is. More so than any season before, Journeys leans into long-form story and character arcs that stretch over huge chunks of the series. Ash's journey to the top of the World Championships, Go participating in Project Mew, Koharu's Eevee adventures, the actual plot of Sword Sword and Shield, multiple mini-arcs with their own dedicated plot lines, the Masters 8 tournament alone takes place over 18 episodes, and again, keep in mind that all of these overarching ideas still have to share space with the more episodic nature of the series at large. Some of these ideas fit nicely into that structure, but not all of them. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with having this many things to do when you have almost 150 episodes to work with, but it also means that certain elements can be inadvertently skipped over if time isn't allotted properly. And fumbling a plot point early on can have cascading negative effects when there is this much going on. There is a very real possibility that Journeys might have the highest proportion of quote-unquote plot-centric episodes from any season so far. Now, that would be fine if all that plot stuff is good, but well, it's just not. A lot of these episodes, especially the plot-centric ones, feel notably unfocused in terms of build-up, characterization, and general atmosphere, with a lot of the overarching ideas getting kind of muddled and less precise in their execution, ultimately leading to this general air of feeling aimless and without clear direction more often than not. What I mean here is that, while there is very clearly a set of goals that our characters are trying to reach, the meat that makes up the journey to said goals feels a bit mushy because it's so underdeveloped. Again, not all of the time, but a lot more often than I would have liked. Before moving forward, I want to briefly address the 800-pound Don fan in the room, the effect that the pandemic had on this anime's production. In a broad sense, it is undeniable that the pandemic had some kind of negative impact on the production of Pokemon Journeys. The broadcast of new episodes was suspended for 6 weeks straight fairly early on, and so it's easy to believe that some amount of content was cut from the original plan. Additionally, much like many other recent anime, Journeys had its share of animator shortages, as directly stated by staff working on the series. And so the anime resorted to 4 different recap episodes over the course of about 3 months near the end of its broadcast. Thus, we can imagine that some kind of content was cut there as well. That said, I will not be using either of these as an excuse for what we have been presented with. What didn't make it into the final product does not count, and therefore has no bearing on my feelings regarding what did. Additionally, while it's easy to speculate that some kind of content was lost, the specific type of content is unknown and cannot be definitively spoken about without a direct message from staff members. This is important to establish because a lot of my general complaints about Journeys are in reference to story elements that feel underdeveloped. The pandemic and animator shortages could have been the reasons for this, or it could have been underdeveloped from the start. We simply don't know, and so I shall make no further reference to this notion. Regardless of the reason behind it, Journeys feels severely lacking in elements tied to Sword and Shield specifically. Hell, some of the notable characters from those games don't even pop up in Journeys at all, with their sole anime appearances being just a few seconds of screen time in web shorts like Twilight Wings and Evolutions. In terms of characters who actually made it into Journeys, very few got a shorter end of the stick than Marnie. From the word go, Marnie has been a fan favorite character from the games via a combination of narrative arc, personality, and visual aesthetics. In the anime, she gets 1 single episode appearance, and they try to cram in as much of her basic traits and backstory as possible, most of which don't even come across that well, and so she becomes completely devoid of interest. Even her brother ends up getting more characterization than her in this episode, which is also the only episode he appears in. If I didn't know who she was from the games, I would be extremely confused as to why she was written as one of Ash's opponents this late in the story, because anime Marnie is so incredibly uninteresting. And that really sucks because I kinda love the premise behind this episode. Team Yell tricks Ash into going to the Spike Town gym for the battle instead of the stadium in order to force a disqualification in Marnie's favor, calling back to Ash's near disqualification against Richie way back in his very first attempt at the Pokemon League. If this had been expanded out to 2 episodes, with the first giving us time to get to know Marnie and Team Yell and ending on Team Yell's deception as a cliffhanger, and the second episode being almost the entirety of the episode that we actually got, this could have been a great way to show off a fan favorite character. Now, I want to clarify that I'm not disappointed solely because of expectations from the video games or that she was poorly written in this episode. I'm disappointed because she was barely written at all, despite the role she plays in the anime and not just her role in Sword and Shield. I could kinda wave away this issue with Volkner because I presume he already had his character explored way back in Diamond and Pearl, justifying the fanfare of his appearance. But Marnie never gets that chance. She is a nothing character in the anime, which seems like both a huge waste of time for an opponent of this high a caliber and a near total lack of interest in the source material this season is adapting. Speaking of which, let's talk about the actual story of Sword and Shield. Episodes 42 to 45 encompass the entirety of the climax from the games involving Chairman Rose and Eternatus, which Journeys just kinda drops on your head almost completely out of nowhere. Aside from introducing the concept of Dynamaxing, the Chairman Rose plot has basically no setup whatsoever. I said earlier that Marnie was probably the Sword and Shield character most screwed over by the anime, but that's only because I had completely forgotten that Chairman Rose even existed in this series. Much like with Marnie, Journeys only gives the briefest of outlines to Chairman Rose's motivations regarding how he uses Eternatus' strength to power the Galar region. So much plot is squeezed into such a small amount of time that I can barely recall anything that didn't feel like a rote recitation of plot points that this arc needed to get through, displaying a complete lack of interest in this plotline. The arc had a few fun moments here and there between Ash's battle strategy against Rose and the dual evolutions of Lucario and Cinderace, and there was some potential to delve into how uncontrolled Dynamaxing could be catastrophic to human-Pokemon relations, but again, most of the focus seems to be on speeding through this part of the plot as quickly as possible so they could get back to the episodic adventures and the more overarching character plots, which is further exemplified by dumping this story arc so early in the series, rather than casually drip-feeding it through several episodes until much further on. I don't think this story arc needed to be the climax of Journeys since that spot belongs to the World Championships, but dropping it this early in the season just felt kinda off. In the end, despite its massive scale, this arc left barely any kind of impression, and I immediately forgot about it once we got back into the episodic content and moved on to other battles. On that subject, the structure for how major battles pop up in Journeys has also gone through some remodeling. In this season, the different classes that make up the World Championships trainer pools and the battles that those trainers engage in are structured around either making appointments to battle or randomly running into other contestants out in the wild. On the one hand, I kinda like how that randomness makes these battles feel more organic. You never know when you're going to run into someone who's around the same rank as you, meaning that a ranked match could happen in just about any episode, as opposed to Ash walking into a gym signifying that progress is about to be made. On the other hand, not having that build-up does take away from the grandiosity of it all. There's nothing wrong with just battling random trainers. In fact, it's possible that that encompasses most of the battles that take place in this franchise. My issue is that they are just random battles, especially when Ash is still fighting in the normal class. Nothing is set up about these characters to make them interesting trainers to battle, which is a bit of a letdown since these characters are basically doing the narrative job that the gym leaders would normally be doing. I understand that on a big picture level, these battles aren't that important, but you still have the option to make them important and make them more interesting than just some random dude with barely any speaking lines. Even when there is a chance to set up something more intricate, Journeys doesn't really follow through. There's this one trainer with a Galad that Ash and Farfetch'd fight multiple times in the series, with their rivalry ending after Farfetch'd finally wins. But I honestly could not tell you a single thing about this trainer or this Galad other than they're a bit on the arrogant side. Outside of that, these characters are about as blank as you can possibly get, making this rivalry mostly unengaging and flat. It also doesn't help that their last encounter was one of the least engaging battles of the season on a technical level, because they just keep using the same moves over and over and over again, but a more narratively intriguing premise would certainly have helped smooth that over, especially in regards to whatever's going on with Ash as a character this season. Which brings us to the first of our lead characters, the problem child turned world champion, Ash Ketchum. Having finally captured the coveted title of Pokemon League champion back in Sun and Moon, Ash is now in a far different position than he has ever been before. Journeys reminds us of this immediately in episode 2 by opening on his trophy shelf, thereby framing this incarnation of him as Champion Ash. No longer the plucky upstart who has to start from the ground floor and learn everything the hard way, Ash has cemented himself as a talented trainer. And I'm so happy that this has been a constant with the Pokemon anime starting with X and Y. The unending character resets with previous seasons seem entirely pointless in hindsight compared to what we've gotten in the past decade. And Journeys seems fit to follow suit, with Ash now having his most lauded title yet. This aspect shines through notably in how he is recognized as the Alolan champion and how he responds to that recognition. And it's in the episodes where he returns to Alola that this is most readily apparent. In episode 76, Ash participates in a team race with Go, and one of the teams that they compete against is a pair of brothers who immediately recognize Ash as the champion and fawn over him constantly. As the race progresses, it becomes apparent that the brothers, whose entire shtick is that they want to show off their Z move, have no clue whatsoever how Z moves actually work, and so Ash gives them proper guidance on the matter, leading to an immediate success. Much like how he mentored Serena in X and Y, with lines that Serena quotes directly in her own episode, Ash displays one of the most important qualities of a champion, being able to convey the knowledge and wisdom he's accrued over his years of training to a younger generation so that they can find success in their own journeys. Skipping ahead to episode 112, Ash takes part in an Alolan Battle Royale, bearing the full weight of his championship title as he goes head-to-head with 3 other participants from the previous league tournament. Whereas episode 76 had Ash use his role as champion to pass on knowledge, here it serves as a reflection of the pride and adoration that the people of Alola have for him. The memories of his battle with Professor Kukui, the roar of the crowd chanting his title, this sense of pride that comes from being Alola's adopted son and first champion, and preparing to take that pride into the Masters 8 tournament, is so immensely intoxicating and exhilarating that it's hard to describe exactly what it feels like unless you've been in a similar situation yourself. Perhaps I'm just reading into things because I still believe the anime was at its peak in Sumo, but even Journeys seems to recognize that this was an incredibly important time for Ash, and any Alola episodes where Ash is the central focus end up showing a deep reverence for him and the time he spent there. And as mentioned earlier, Ash's history in other regions is celebrated as well through his reunions with friends and rivals past. Ash feels like he has seen and done so much by this point, and Journeys hones in on that fact and celebrates it as much as possible. Unfortunately, that's pretty much the only interesting element of Ash's character this season. That's not to say he's regressed in any way, but there's also a very palpable stagnancy to his character, as though the story has run out of ways to challenge him on a mental or emotional level. He's still a fun character to watch and gives decent insight for others to learn from, but that's about it. There doesn't seem to be much left for him to do personally aside from being the #1 trainer, and his internal characterization is left mostly unchallenged in that regard on a fundamental level. Now, that's not inherently a bad thing, but it does feel like wasted potential in terms of this being Ash's last season as the main character. Perhaps the most notable example of this is with Kibana, whom Ash faces off against as his last match before making it into the Masters 8. Early in the match, it appears as though Kibana has the upper hand, and he takes the opportunity to challenge Ash's resolve, asking him why he wants to battle Dande so badly. Kibana, who, like Ash, sees Dande as an ultimate end goal, is unpersuaded by Ash's fascination, believing that if he doesn't have the conviction to defeat Dande, rather than just have fun battling him, then he doesn't deserve to face him at all. In response, Ash says, "Yeah, I do really want to beat him." And then the match continues. And that's just kinda lame. Not only is Ash's statement of resolve spat out as fast as possible and lacking any impacting execution whatsoever, it's also just not an interesting response on a core level. "Yeah, I do want to do the thing that you just said" is so anticlimactic and unengaging that it made me wonder why they even brought it up at all. If they had really wanted to tap into what makes Ash such an interesting protagonist, or really just make this moment interesting in any way whatsoever, then the obvious response would be for Ash to push the question even further. Why does he want to beat Dande? Why does he want to win the World Championship? What exactly is he doing here? I don't know what the answer to that might be, but that seems like where this line of thought should be taken, rather than just accepting what Kibana is saying without resistance and moving on as if it didn't even happen. There was a moment where I briefly thought that Ash should have refuted the statement altogether, but that would have been entirely out of character. There is no scenario where Ash would say that winning is not his primary goal while participating in a tournament, but to simply leave it at that is just uninteresting from where Ash is at this point in his career. It also doesn't help that Kibana, much like many of Ash's opponents this season, isn't really built up as someone noteworthy on a character level for Ash to take down. Yet another casualty of Journey's not taking the time to properly build up potentially interesting characters. Again, it's not like they do this with every important character. Constantly bringing Cynthia into Sinnoh-centric episodes or episodes related to ancient ruins felt like a natural way to build her up as an important wall for Ash to break through, and his battles against the fighting-type gym leader Saito being fueled by the drive of his own fighting-type Pokemon, Riolu, made for a solid rivalry during the midsection of the series. But Kibana directly challenging Ash's core motivations for entering the World Championships is something else entirely. And so his refusal to accept Dande's fascination with Ash should have been given much more focus. Speaking of which, Dande himself might actually be the perfect final opponent for Ash solely because he basically is Ash but with a better battle record. That childlike fascination with Pokemon, his seemingly disorganized and chaotic approach to training, that constant drive to keep winning and bettering himself every day. He is literally Ash in just about every way that matters, and that's a pretty cool opponent for Ash's final battle. Not in the sense of Ash needs to learn something about himself from this encounter, but more along the lines of Ash seeing himself reflected so directly in another person who is so awe-inspiring and almost otherworldly in terms of battling prowess. This is the Ash vs. Red battle that Pokemon fans have been misguidedly craving for so long, except it's even better because Ash and Dande can so intimately relate to each other with how they feel about Pokemon. But again, for as cool as this idea is in concept, the execution does leave a bit to be desired. While I do think Dande is definitely one of the best written and best utilized characters in this season, I also wish they had given Ash a bit more to do with him in the many interactions they have, especially near the end of the series when Ash starts training with him directly. It just feels like something's missing, like there was a chance for one last interesting character arc for Ash to go through. Despite this being his biggest challenge yet, they really didn't give Ash much to do on a character level that made him any more interesting than he already was. Admittedly, Ash already was an interesting character by the end of Sun and Moon, but it still feels like a missed opportunity. All that said, for as much as I'm not hugely entertained by the particular arc that Ash goes through, I do want to rebuke what seems to be like the most vocal criticism of how he was handled this season, his Pokemon team. There is one very crucial caveat to this, but we'll get to that in a bit. Strictly based on stats and rarity, Journey's Ash easily has the strongest team he's collected so far. Alongside the ever-present Pikachu, he's also acquired several fan-favorite Titans like Dragonite, Gengar, and Lucario, as well as some new Galarian heavy hitters in the form of Dracovic and SwSh. And, much like in past seasons, they all come with him willingly rather than Ash having to weaken and capture them. The obvious difference here is that Ash is starting out with a vastly stronger team than he normally does, leading to the criticism that Ash is being handed his wins on a silver platter. But I kinda disagree with this line of thought. Again, this is something that Ash does all the time. This does not seem out of place at all as far as Ash's capture history goes. And with him being this experienced as a trainer and being able to connect with Pokemon so immediately and deeply, it's not that surprising that higher level Pokemon would be susceptible to this. I also think that these heart-to-heart moments are really solid on an emotional level. Gengar being ditched by his old trainer because of his nature, Dragonair doing his best to learn what those around him find easy, Riolu/Lucario's constant drive for excellence. All of these are incredibly simple scenarios, but still compelling and easy to get invested in so that you can see why these Pokemon would throw their lot in with Ash instead of just continuing their journeys alone. As for the strength of the Pokemon being captured, that corresponds directly with the specific goal Ash has for this season. This isn't just another collect 8 gym badges and go through a standard league tournament story, he's shooting for the World Championships, immediately setting the bar significantly higher. Having him build a base level team from nothing and still win would be even less believable than easily accruing a high level team from the outset. The obvious response to that would be, well then don't have him win, but like, come on. It's the end of his run as protagonist. There's no way he wasn't going to win. My point is that the narrative concessions that were made in order to put Ash in a position where it was believable that he could win the World Championships with a fresh team of Pokemon fell neatly in line with what the series has already presented to us. So I really don't have a problem with maxing out his lineup. However, I don't want to completely dismiss the idea that Ash's rise to the top this season felt too easy. While it's still logically believable on all accounts, there was one aspect that felt a bit lacking in the standard roster of things that you do in the Pokemon anime. And that aspect is training. While there are definitely some key training moments, mostly right before the Masters 8 tournament begins, Ash's training regimen overall doesn't feel especially intense this season, which you wouldn't think would be the case for someone who ends the season being the #1 trainer in the world. I can't say for certain whether it's a matter of him actually training less frequently, or the lack of gym checkpoints to signify progress, or just the sheer amount of stuff happening that takes the focus away from him, but that feeling of being more lax with training than one might expect still lingers after all is said and done. With as high a title as this didn't feel especially difficult for Ash, and maybe that's what they were going for. Maybe they wanted to coast mostly on Ash's signature intuition and insane battle strategies, and those strategies are just as creative and exciting as ever. But, much like the build-up to each individual match, Ash's overall build-up didn't feel all that present. And, as a result, this season feels kind of redundant. The constant struggle to reach the top ended when he won the Alolan League, and he's mostly been coasting ever since. For as fun as he is on a moment-to-moment basis, Ash really didn't do anything all that impressive aside from the Masters 8 tournament and maybe his rivalry with Saito. As sad as it is to say, Ash has outlived his usefulness as Pokemon's main character. and I'm happy that this was where they decided to end his tenure, rather than continue to stretch him out indefinitely for another 8 seasons. Speaking of things that have outlived their usefulness, Team Rocket. I'm not gonna mince words here. Journeys has one of the worst interpretations of Team Rocket so far, if not the very worst. I would have no problem counting on one hand the number of good Team Rocket moments I witnessed this season, which is such a massive letdown coming off their best interpretation to date in Sun and Moon. I also already have 2 different videos on that, so you can check those out later as well, but generally speaking, what makes Sumo Team Rocket so great is that it gave them so much more stuff to do outside of try to steal Pikachu over and over. They get excited over catching new Pokemon. They have a food truck that they seem decently passionate about despite how little attention it gets. They have a contentious relationship with the Beware whom they live with. And said Beware is constantly subverting the blasting off again that Team Rocket is known for. Heck, sometimes they just venture off into the jungle to unwind and relieve some stress. They actually feel like believable human beings instead of repetitive thugs, and Journeys takes most of that away from them. With very few exceptions, it's just the same old song and dance we got for almost 20 years straight before Sumo. Their best episode this season was when they traveled back to Alola and saw the Pokemon they had caught there. And their best episode in Aim to be a Pokemon Master was when they got back all their Pokemon from previous regions and played to each of their partner's strengths to pull off the ultimate Pikachu capture. Neither of which speaks well to how Journeys writes them when they're not propped up with fan service. Back when I was in the middle of watching it, I got a bit of flack on Twitter for saying that Journeys was the worst version of Team Rocket, with some people saying that X and Y was the worst. And while I definitely agree that X and Y Team Rocket was also pretty bad, there is one very crucial difference that comes in the form of the Rocket Prize Master, a machine that Team Rocket calls into battle to give them whatever Pokemon they need in that particular moment. Now, as a concept, that's actually a cool idea. Not knowing what Pokemon Team Rocket are going to bring to the table actually makes their battles kind of interesting for once, something that rarely happens even when they're written well. However, this concept is very much a double-edged sword, one that cuts the user far deeper than the opponent. Without a concrete team to rely on and have actual connections with, Jesse, James, and Meowth are no better than any other Team Rocket thugs, more than happy to use Pokemon as disposable tools rather than sentient beings whom you form a personal bond with. For as annoying and repetitive as X and Y Team Rocket were, they at least still remembered to do that. Their own personal Pokemon and the bonds they share with them were the sole factors that made the trio tolerable despite the boring repetitions they engaged in. And Journeys couldn't even get that part right. What makes it even worse is that there were multiple Pokemon this season that could have fulfilled this role. Early on, they catch a Choodle because they learn it can evolve into Dreadnought, but rather than keep it with them to train, they send it to Giovanni for the glory of Team Rocket, and so it only makes a few brief appearances later on, which was such a letdown because the deadpan delivery of its humor was genuinely funny. There's also the Morpeko that's squatting in their hideout and constantly eating all their food. But saying that they form a bond with Morpeko would be a hell of a stretch. If anything, they actively dislike it and spend an entire episode trying to get rid of it before James chickens out at the last second. And their relationship still doesn't change after this. Ironically, aside from their pitiful success rate, Journeys presents the trio as the ideal Team Rocket soldiers, completely obedient to Giovanni and totally lacking in uniqueness as Pokemon trainers who form no attachments to the Pokemon they battle with and use them solely as tools for conquest. And the small assortment of exceptions aren't nearly enough to say that these three are anything more than the Pokemon they use, completely disposable. Fortunately, I can say the exact opposite about one of Ash's new companions this season, Koharu. which apparently is somewhat of a controversial take, I guess? I'm not super entrenched in anti-poke discourse because I don't hate myself that much and I only get brief snapshots of general opinions, but if that is the case, then I feel as though Koharu has been judged far too harshly. It could also be that there were certain expectations set up by casting the legendary Kana Hanazawa as her voice actress, though this isn't exactly a rarity with main characters in Pokemon nowadays. My main theory on why she's so polarizing is because she doesn't actually show up that often in early parts of the series. It's not until much later that she is consistently going out with Ash and Go on their research journeys, which might end up being disappointing to some people, though this element ends up reinforcing the most interesting parts of her journey. In any case, I will admit that as far as central characters go, Koharu is somewhat unique in how she interacts with Pokemon in that she doesn't really seem to care all that much about them at first, which might be even rarer in this series than characters who outright dislike or fear Pokemon. For just how much the anime hammers on the idea that Pokemon are these incredible creatures that brighten the lives of the people around them, having a character almost completely unmoved by their existence is a bit jarring. Outside of her Yamper, which she cares for just as one would care for a real-life dog, she doesn't see Pokemon as being that extraordinary or interesting. That alone is a pretty cool idea for a main character. But Journeys also goes out of its way to set up this trait in a way that feeds into her character arc. As the daughter of Professor Sakuragi, Koharu was raised around Pokemon constantly. As a result, many of the people around her often assumed that she would follow in her father's footsteps and study Pokemon, and this assumption didn't sit well with Koharu, compounding her general disinterest. This also feeds into why she feels a bit absent from early parts of the series. As someone who isn't super interested in Pokemon and just wants to maintain a normal school life, there's not much incentive for her to go out on these grand Pokemon adventures. However, as she starts to travel more and get more involved with Ash and Go's research, she does start to show more interest. Again, it's not like she outright dislikes Pokemon, she just didn't find them especially fascinating. But through the journeys she takes with kids her own age who find Pokemon to be the most fascinating things in the world, it's no wonder that she gradually found something about them that piqued her interest. As someone who has gotten many people into anime through sheer exposure, I can attest that this is a very real phenomenon. This gradual change is hastened even further when, much like many of the female characters in this anime, she has a fateful encounter with an Eevee. Did I groan a little when I realized that Eevee would be making its 4th appearance as a main team member in this series? Yeah, a little. But as a conduit through which her trainer's character arc is explored, Journeys has perhaps the most interesting interpretation. As you might know, Eevee is unique within the world of Pokemon for having so many different evolutions, and Journeys capitalizes on that to the fullest degree so far. While Eevee are known for being genetically unstable, this Eevee in particular seems especially so in that she doesn't seem to evolve when she comes into contact with standard criteria like evolution stones, almost as though she is hesitant to evolve. With that, we can easily draw parallels to Koharu, someone who is unsure on which path to take for her future. After taking Eevee into her care, Koharu decides that she wants to let Eevee see all of the different evolutions available to her, allowing Eevee to make a more informed decision on which path she wants to take. From this, we get the bulk of the Koharu-centric episodes, in which she and Eevee travel around and meet all the different evolutions to see what makes each one special, even including Suiren's Eevee to show that not evolving at all is also on the table. Making Copycat the central pillar of Eevee's battle strategy also integrates nicely into this idea, allowing Eevee to get more practical experience with each evolution's power set. It's a lovely bit of thematic and narrative symmetry to give more weight to each encounter. Using Indifference as a starting point also allows for the series to leave a stronger impact with its visual presentation. If you're gonna convince us that a character is becoming more enamored with Pokemon, then presenting those encounters in a visually exciting way is of paramount importance, and Journeys seems to pull this off pretty well. The Galarian Ponyta episode in particular stands out not just as the most visually interesting of Koharu's episodes, but all of Journeys at large. The lighting, color design, and general atmosphere, bolstered by the more ambient music selections, truly embody the magic that surrounds these magical creatures, making this one of my favorite episodes of Pokemon, period. At the end of the series, Koharu ends up choosing the path of Pokemon research, taking up the role of research fellow upon Ash and Go's resignations. And while this might seem like it goes against what her character was initially drafted as, I don't think that's necessarily the case. Koharu's main conflict at the outset was that people assumed she would follow in her father's footsteps by default, not because Koharu displayed an intense passion for Pokemon. Once that passion takes root, however, it seems natural that she would want to explore that passion even more on her own. Personally, I might have been a bit more satisfied if she had chosen something different, but this also isn't a final choice by any stretch. She's just continuing down a line of thought that sprouted through her connection with Eevee. And so whatever path she chooses in the end is one that she will be approaching on her own terms, rather than an assumption made by outsiders. Admittedly, I do wish she was in more episodes just because I think she's generally well written and I like seeing her on screen, but I'm still very satisfied with what we got. As for the other companion this season, well, let's get into it. Go is certainly a character that exists in this show. Now, before I delve into my gripes, I do want to at least give him credit for being well-defined and mostly likable in terms of his core personality and how well that personality is fleshed out. He's a nerd obsessed with Pokemon and the mountains of research data associated with them, and he loves to flaunt that knowledge whenever he can. At the same time, he's not the most sociable person, and being dropped into hypersocial situations leaves him feeling awkward and out of place. He's also not really a team player at the start, but gradually learns how to be as the story progresses. The Cubone episode in particular tackles the dichotomy of Go's conflicting nature rather well through a Pokemon that he shares a similar background with. In terms of characterization, he's perfectly fine overall. Even great in some instances. The only thing that bothers me about Go strictly on a character level isn't Go himself, but instead how he relates to Ash. Or rather, how the anime tells us he relates to Ash. In the penultimate episode, Go has a bit of an emotional breakdown over Ash deciding to go on a new journey without him, conveying the idea that Go feels an immensely strong bond with Ash. And I just didn't really get that while watching this season. I'm not saying they're not friends, they very clearly are, but not so much that this scene felt warranted. Ash doesn't really seem to treat him with any more gravitas than someone you enjoy hanging out with on the weekends, so I don't get that deep connection from him either. Perhaps this can be seen as a natural consequence of the overall tone that Journeys takes towards its narrative. Of all the seasons of Pokemon, Journeys is by far the most lighthearted in terms of both content and tone, as I explained earlier with its heavy bend towards comedy. As a result, however, Journeys lacks a certain amount of tension. Even near world-ending events don't seem particularly dire or stressful, something that was very much present in previous seasons, because that's the tone that Journeys wants to stick with. And so those bonds forged through fire that Ash has with so many of his other companions don't really show up here. I feel like I've said this like 20 times already in this video, but it's just kinda disappointing and feels like it missed out on something greater. But that's not really the biggest problem with Go. No, the biggest problem is that Go is a genius at catching Pokemon. Or, more accurately, the narrative has decided that Go in particular has an incredibly easy time catching Pokemon without much justification. Now, much like most of the narrative concepts I've talked about in this video and in many other videos, that concept by itself is not the issue. There are very few narrative ideas in isolation that I think are genuinely bad at their cores. As always, it comes down to execution. And there are two massive pitfalls that this concept immediately plummets into. The first and most notable is that watching Go catch Pokemon without even trying over and over again is fucking boring. Throw a Pokeball, catch a Pokemon. Throw a Pokeball, catch a Pokemon. Throw a Pokeball, catch a Pokemon, over and over and over, to the point where it feels like catching doesn't even mean anything anymore. Occasionally, they drop a more difficult Pokemon in his path that actually does require some amount of battling, but that itself is kind of rare, and said battle resulting in any kind of significant challenge is even rarer. The obvious element I've been skipping over so far is that, even without official confirmation, it is plainly obvious that Go is meant to represent the capture style of the Pokemon Go video games. Like, it's literally his name. But just because the reasoning behind the idea is obvious doesn't mean that its implementation is a good idea. Taking the core mechanic of a game that doesn't have a fully realized narrative and applying that to one of the main characters in a linear television series comes with some drawbacks, namely in that it's not fun or interesting to watch. This next part isn't really relevant, but I've never found time to properly say it. I don't really like Pokemon Go that much. I respect it for having a huge impact on community engagement, and it's really cool that so many other people want to interact this much with a franchise I love. Seeing dozens of people scattered across a single location just to find a Dratini is really neat. But, strictly on a mechanics level, I just don't think the game is very fun. It's repetitive and cyclical, just like the character who bears its namesake. Again though, this wasn't a bum idea from the start. All it would have taken for this to not be terrible was to tweak it a bit and insert some kind of challenge. Add in concepts like weak points that Go has to identify for each and every Pokemon he captures, and show how he came to his conclusion on where that weak spot was. And you can compound that even further by adding in layers of difficulty in hitting said weak spot. Go is already established to be incredibly knowledgeable about Pokemon, so this seems like a no-brainer. It's not a perfect solution, but it still would have been way better than Capture Jesus chucking Pokeballs at everything that moves and coming out on top with almost no effort 95% of the time. The second point is that this concept only works within the bounds of this specific season and immediately falls apart if you have seen any other season of the TV series. This matters because, as we established towards the beginning of this video, this season is firmly selling itself as a sequel and not a soft reset. What's the one thing that just about every single entry in the TV anime, as well as the video games for that matter, have drilled into your head? In order to capture a Pokemon, you have to weaken it first. And the only exceptions to that rule are when the Pokemon decides to join their trainer willingly, which most of Go's Pokemon have not done. They hammered this concept in every time Ash went through a reset in the first 700-ish episodes of this show. The captures that fall outside those parameters are almost always ones that are played as a joke. His very first catch being a Caterpie, one of the weakest known Pokemon at the time, followed by him showboating like he just won the league, was very obviously meant to be humorous, as was his exaggerated showdown with Krabby that was followed up by him not knowing how Pokemon parties work. And again, these few examples are minute in number in comparison to when actual effort is on display. It's not just a holdover from how the mechanics of the mainline games work, It's a pretty basic narrative tool. If a character wants something that has value, seeing them put work into acquiring it has a cathartic narrative payoff, and the degree of work should scale up accordingly as the value or rarity of something increases. But Journeys doesn't really follow that concept at all, leading to one of the most dissatisfying episodes in the entire series. But before we get to that, I need to take you on a brief aside over here. Okay, just gonna set you right there. Okay, Pokemon fans, eyes up, look at me. Pokemon fans, look at me. What is happening right now? That's not like a rhetorical question or anything. What is happening right now? If your answer is, I, the video maker, am directly addressing you, the audience, then yes, you are technically correct, but that's not really all that I'm getting at. What precisely is happening right now? For example, I am speaking to you from in front of a wall of anime DVDs and merchandise and such because it's a video essay cliche to show off your nerd cred. I'm talking with my hands because I'm Italian, bop-da-beep-boop. I've been slowly leaning closer and closer towards the camera as time goes on to intensify this moment. Do you see what I'm getting at? What is directly spoken in a given scene is not the only thing that's happening, and it is very much not the only thing that affects how you view what is happening. In an audio-visual medium, what you see is just as, if not more important, than what you hear. And I highly recommend Lindsay Ellis's videos on the Transformers franchise for a more in-depth look at this concept. Now with all that said, let's talk about the Suicune episode. So, the central idea behind episode 53 is that Go catches Suicune. Now, I am not fundamentally against any of the characters capturing a legendary Pokemon. Honestly, I was kinda hoping Ash would pick one up himself at some point. That's not why I dislike this episode. It all comes down to execution. First, I am going to describe to you the bare bones elements of what happens leading up to this capture. Multiple Suicune sightings have been reported near a certain lake, which is anomalous in regards to Suicune's typical behavior, so Ash and Go are sent to investigate. When they arrive, they find a group of Pokemon hunters dumping garbage into the lake. As Ash and Go engage the hunters, Suicune shows up, purifies the lake, and attacks the hunters. The lead hunter asserts that Suicune is probably tired after doing so much purifying, which Go reiterates for the audience as the hunters attack. As the hunters close in on success, Go decides that the best way to save Suicune is to capture it, and so he does. Based solely on that, some of you might think it reasonable that Go was able to capture Suicune. But again, that's just the bare bones summary of what happens. So let's fill the scene out a bit with some visual details. After purifying the lake, Suicune immediately launches a series of heavy attacks, freezing one of the hunters' trucks solid and knocking over another with a hydro pump, then jumps onto the frozen truck and howls to assert dominance, and we can see a visible aura being emitted from Suicune, possibly symbolizing its strength and aggression. So let me ask you, does that sound like a Pokemon that has been weakened to a significant degree? The only visual evidence prior to the start of the battle that might suggest Suicune has been weakened is an ambiguous facial expression Suicune makes while the hunter is trying to intimidate it. My initial reading of this was simply that Suicune was pissed off at the hunter, but this could have been an attempt to show Suicune's weakness. Again, the expression is too ambiguous to make a definitive statement. Plus, it only lasts about 1 second, so you don't really get a solid look at it. Speaking of length, this entire sequence, from Suicune showing up on camera for the first time to the completed capture signal on Go's Pokeball, takes less than 2 minutes of runtime. Furthermore, the time from Suicune engaging the hunter's Pokemon to the shot where Suicune is very obviously in danger of being captured by them is approximately 33 seconds, of which 18 seconds is devoted to shots of Ash and Go engaging the hunter's Pokemon, meaning that only 15 seconds of screen time was dedicated to visually conveying Suicune starting to lose. This was an extremely short battle, perhaps the shortest battle with a legendary Pokemon in the entire anime. There's simply not enough time between Suicune showing up and knocking over heavy vehicles and Suicune is about to lose to convey what the story wants to convey. Weak visual cues combined with battle pacing that's far too brisk for the scenario results in the most infuriating capture Go makes in the entire series. And that's really unfortunate because I actually like the rest of the episode after this moment. Go attempting to connect with Suicune and earn its trust was solidly written and endearing, and had it been this sense of trust that allowed Go to capture Suicune in the climax of this episode, rather than towards the beginning, I might have liked this episode quite a bit. But because the visual presentation of the lead up to said capture was so poor, I ended up hating it. We'll be circling back to the topic of visuals in a little bit, but for now let's refocus on Go himself. The one saving grace for Go in terms of challenge is the Project Mew subplot, in which he undertakes several trials in order to join an expedition team that is attempting to study Mew. This subplot is introduced as a recommended path for Go since his dream is to eventually capture Mew. But it's through the provocations of Gary that Go decides to take on the challenge after Gary immediately puts Go in his place and cools off any hotshot tendencies that might have been flaring up. And this is one of my favorite episodes from Journeys. On top of being excellently paced and visually stunning, this actually feels like a difficult decision for Go to make. And you can feel the disappointment he has with himself as Gary rubs it in his face how unimpressive he is. Also, I just love Gary. Call me a Gen 1er or whatever, but there's something about that unapologetic smugness from a character who has very clearly earned it that makes him an absolute joy to watch. And his relationship with Go, a trainer who he sees some potential in but obviously does not respect all that much at the moment, is made even more interesting by his relationship with Ash, someone who Gary previously viewed as not even being worth his time, but now sees as having earned his place at the table of greatness. Gary's just a really cool character and was the perfect catalyst for Go to actually have to work really hard at something for once. From there on out, the Project Mew episodes would consistently challenge not just Go's ability to understand and capture Pokemon, but also his emotional resolve to see this path through. Eventually, Go secures the very last spot on the survey team that is being sent out to research Mew directly. But the day the operation is scheduled to take place coincides directly with Ash's final battle against Donde. Ultimately, Go chooses the mission over his friend's battle, which Ash seems totally supportive of. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Go to realize his dream, and he needs to see that ambition through even if it means supporting his friend from afar rather than watching him live. This choice could have been much more impacting if I actually felt like Go and Ash were super close friends, but it's not incompetent by any measure. It's serviceable and definitely one of Go's stronger moments. In the end, for as much as they try to salvage him in the second half, it's hard for me to appreciate a lot of the good things about Go because of the whole capture Jesus thing, making him one of the more poorly executed characters to become one of Ash's traveling companions. Not the worst, mind you, but definitely somewhere in the bottom half by my reckoning due to some base level contrivances and a lack of visual prowess to ease said contrivances. Speaking of visuals, there are a few topics regarding some visual elements that I want to touch on briefly before moving forward. Journeys follows in the footsteps of Sun and Moon with a more flexible style of animation in comparison to previous seasons, allowing for a much wider and more complex range of visual accomplishments. The clearest example of this is that the character acting for the Pokemon is top-notch, easily one of the best parts of this season. Journeys might have the strongest cast of Pokemon I've seen so far, primarily because it does such a fantastic job with how they express themselves visually in the non-battling scenes. Laughing, dancing, conversing, getting annoyed, wallowing in sadness, there's such a wide variety of visual cues that the Pokemon are able to execute in such vivid ways that make them feel so lifelike and well developed. Pikachu alone might have more unique facial expressions in this season than in the entire first half of this franchise. It's just so fun and entertaining that it never gets old. Switching gears to the topic of battles, Journeys is also far and away the most visually stunning in terms of animation power, capitalizing on the more flexible character designs even more so than Sun and Moon. I'd be hard-pressed to find a more visually exciting cut from the entire TV series than the final showdown between Pikachu and Charizard. However, I did notice that while the raw animation has certainly been amped up, the framing and general shot composition seem a bit less interesting than they have been in the past. There are a few exceptions in the more emotionally charged episodes. By the way, I just want to briefly mention that episodes 83 and 87 are easily in my top 5 for the season because of how strong their emotional narratives are, but on the whole, it does feel like a bit of a step back. Perhaps this was a deliberate choice to let the Pokemon acting and action Sakuga take center stage, but when those elements aren't present, the lack of cinematic excitement can be keenly felt. With the most apparent example being the Pokemon contest in episode 105, paling in comparison to even the weakest performances from X and Y. Not a disastrous setback, but still one of the many mild disappointments I encountered. And of course, the audio end of this production is incredibly solid as well, with the soundtrack being handled by none other than the legendary Yuki Hayashi of My Hero Academia, Haikyuu, and Precure fame. Aside from the hype that is typical of his work, I found his softer tracks to be some of the most impacting, with their almost ambient nature dredging up as much emotion as possible for the story's most tender moments. There is one reinterpretation of a theme from Sword and Shield that gets used a lot where the choral line sounds kind of fake, but aside from that, I loved the energy that one of my favorite composers brought to one of my favorite franchises. Before moving on to the final stretch of Ash's journey, I want to briefly mention the one episode special that aired at the end of last year titled That Distant Blue Sky. And I shall now drop my potentially controversial take that this one episode had more emotional impact in it than a solid 90% of everything from Journeys. I highly advise you watch this episode before I continue because I'm about to spoil the central twist. Granted, it's a fairly predictable twist, but a twist nonetheless. During this episode, Ash meets a boy named Haruto who tells him that he's never touched a Pokemon before, even though he really wants to. Eventually, Ash meets the boy's parents and discovers that Haruto actually died years ago, meaning that Ash has been talking to a ghost this whole time. During his life, Haruto loved Pokemon more than anything in the world and couldn't wait to set off on his own journey. A journey that was tragically cut short by an unexpected illness. So, with Ash being the person that he is, he finds his own way to fulfill Haruto's desire to touch Pokemon. Later, while eating dinner, Ash suddenly bursts into tears, unable to consciously process Haruto's tragedy and, more importantly, how lucky he is to be alive. It's an incredibly sobering reminder that not all of us get to have our own journeys, and that those who do should treasure the time they have. You never know when your time will be up and what you're going to miss out on. You might think that you have your whole life ahead of you, but not all of us are that lucky. and the use of the losing your hat to a Mankey plot point to tie Ash to Haruto suggests just how lucky Ash is despite their similar circumstances. While Pokemon is a comedy adventure series, it can very easily knock it out of the park when it wants to do drama with simple yet incredibly moving storylines that truly understand what this series is about. It's just a shame that most of the episode kinda looks like crap. Like, I get that it's trying to recapture the aesthetic of the original series, but man, some of these shots are just a 2-pack of ass. Anyway, let's move on. And so we come to the grand finale, the last hurrah of Ash and Pikachu's journey through this fantastical world, aimed to be a Pokemon Master. With this being the last arc of a 25-year run, there were certainly a lot of expectations that would naturally come with this ending. Would it be one last epic adventure that ranks amongst the most intense we've seen so far? Would it be a series of conclusive reunions and resolutions to tie up all the loose ends Ash has left during his journey across the world? Would it be a series of intensely thematic episodes that attempt to answer the all-important question of what it truly means to be a Pokemon Master? The reality, as we now know, was actually none of these things. Instead, we basically just got more Pokemon the same way we always have. 11 episodes of mostly low stakes and down-to-earth adventures. Really, its only unique attributes are that Misty and Brock come back, and there's a subplot involving Latias. Yes, it does play heavily into nostalgia and fan service by cycling through as many of Ash's previous Pokemon as possible, but aside from that, everything else is just business as usual. And frankly, I think that's kinda cool and very fitting. Ash has basically done it all at this point. He's the world champion and he's saved the world several times over, even outside the high-stakes plots normally reserved for the movies. There's really nothing else they could come up with that could top anything that's come before. It's also not like his journey is actually coming to an end. This is just the last that we get to see of it as the audience, even though his journey towards becoming a Pokemon Master will extend well into the future. Speaking of which, what exactly is a Pokemon Master? What conclusion does Ash finally come to on that? Well, if you were looking for some grand sweeping gesture that tied everything together in a neat little bow, you probably weren't watching the same series I was for the past quarter century. Would I have liked that? Of course I would. Who wouldn't want a larger-than-life resolution to this 25-year odyssey? Instead, we got the pretty obvious answer from a character whose motivations have always been as obvious as they could possibly be. Being a Pokemon Master means being friends with every Pokemon in the world, meaning that there's always more adventure ahead. Simple and straightforward, yet endlessly ambitious and full of optimism. A very Ash way to live right to the very end. And that's it. Ash and Pikachu run off into the sunset, and their journey continues forevermore. Honestly, my initial plans before watching this final arc was to do a video just on Aim to be a Pokemon Master, and in hindsight, I'm very glad I didn't do that because, surprisingly, there's really nothing incredibly intriguing about this segment on its own, though it's still immensely fun and exciting throughout. Much like Ash's battle strategy, this ending was completely unexpected, yet still superbly entertaining and enjoyable down to the very last moment. Believe me when I say that I did not plan for this video to be anywhere near as long as it ended up being. But, to my surprise, Journeys offered plenty of content for me to sink my teeth into. For better or worse. Do I wish that it had given a stronger ending to one of the most iconic anime protagonists of all time? Yeah, that's definitely a feeling I'm left with, but it's also not nearly as strong a feeling as I had feared it would be. Journeys just feels kinda middle of the road as far as this franchise is concerned, but it's also my least favorite of the seasons that I've actually completed so far. There's so much about it that could have been so much better, with its faults made all the more apparent by what came directly before. But I certainly wouldn't want Ash's run to be extended any more than it already has just to get it right. Ash's journey is over, and our new heroes, Liko and Roy, are already off to a strong start for their journeys and the journeys that thousands of budding Pokemon fans around the world have just started for the first time. It's a time of new beginnings, but also a time of endings, as we wave a final farewell to one of the mainstays of this franchise. Thank you, Ash and Pikachu, for 25 years of fun, excitement, and wonder. And thanks to all of you who somehow managed to reach the end of this video. I knew about a third of the way through watching Journeys that I was going to have way too much to say, so hopefully it wasn't too chaotic. And this isn't even the last stupidly long Pokemon project you might see from me in the near future. Honestly though, I'm just glad this video is finally out after almost half a year of planning and production. I'm behind on almost 3 full seasons of anime broadcast now, so I'm gonna go catch up on those and disappear off the face of the earth for the next 4 to 6 months, aside from the vlogs on the side channel, of course. With the ANN gig done and the final season of 12 Days complete, I've decided that I'm just not setting any deadlines on projects anymore. Videos will come out whenever they come out. There are still a few big ideas I want to put to film, but they all require a massive amount of research and watch time, so it's gonna take a while. Maybe I'll put out something shorter in the meantime, but who's to say? Special thanks to Rourke Tenjoin, Chris Adili, Ryan Johnson, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.